Professor Wergely's here. We're in number 2 text.html. We're about to go to number 3. Before we do, make sure you save this file. In addition, we added a lot of space in between the script tags, which is not normally there. I was doing that so you could just focus on the JavaScript. Make sure you get rid of those spaces if you put those in your code, and make the code nice and neat. When you submit your challenges, you're going to want to make sure the code's nice and neat. It's all tabbed out. You can see here I have it tabbed out if it's a child. Inside the script tag, I tab everything out nice and neat. I have spaces here so you can see the functions easily, and the code looks nice and neat. Make sure you do this when you submit your challenge. That way, the TAs can grade it easier. The easier your challenge is to grade, the happier the TAs are going to be, the more effort they can see that you put in, the easier they can read your code, which is going to make your grade much better. So make sure you are writing nice and pretty code. Otherwise, it's hard to read. The TAs can't find what you did, and hopefully you get the picture. Now we're going to number 3, radios.html. Make sure you save this file before we go. Inside radios, you're going to see the radio buttons that we implemented earlier. And here I'm going to try to get the radio, set the radio, and get all radio values. In this example, I've sped things up by 1, putting the on click. Okay, we went over that several times. I'm hoping that you understand that by now. With the button, you need to on click, and that needs to link to a JavaScript function. The JavaScript function name needs to be case sensitive the same, in addition to having the parentheses. So when you click on get radio, we're going to call the get radio function, which is up here. And you'll see that name is the same. And then I have a function declaration with this block of code. Now let's just focus on getting the radio's value. So what am I going to do? If I'm getting a value, most likely you're going to store it into a variable. So I'm going to call the radio object. You'll see this is camel case, radio is lowercase, followed by a second word, which is uppercase. So that's going to be camel case. I'm going to use the DOM. Well, I'm going to use the word document, which is calling the DOM API. I'm going to call the DOM's API get element by ID. Now, what ID am I looking for? Let's just say I get the first radio element. Here you'll see the first radio element is Raptor with ID equal to Raptor. So let's look for that ID. I'm going to do get element by ID, which is a method function call. I'm going to put the Raptor keyword there. I'm going to do a semicolon for now. And let's just see what we get. So every time you're working with a new input object, or you're working with a new object in general, I recommend that you print that out to the console to see what you have and to understand what you're working with. So here I'm going to print this radio object to the console, and let's see what we have. So I'm going to save my file, refresh that on the browser, and click on the button, Get Radio. Here you'll see the button worked, so the function was called. I have an input with ID equal to Raptor. If I open this up, let's see what we have. Now before, we use .value. So let's see if we use .value with the radio button. If I scroll down and look at .value is Velociraptor. If I look at the value for Iguanodon, it's going to be Iguanodon. Here is that keyword value in the HTML code. So value equals Velociraptor, value equals Iguanodon, value equals T-Rex. Does that tell me whether they selected the element? Let me select Iguanodon and click Get Radio. And let's look at that same value. So I'm going to open up the second object, go down, look at its value. You'll see it's also Velociraptor. So value does not tell me whether the radio button was selected or not. And we can print this out just so we can see it change. So I'll do a console log. Since I'm only printing out a string, I can do a log versus a directory. Log is going to print out a string. If I do the dot notation, you'll see log takes a string. If I do .d, directory is going to take an object. So if I do log, I'm just going to print out a string, the radio object's value. But that's not going to help us. We need to determine whether the radio button was selected or not. So I'm going to start from the top, and let's just look at the attributes that we have. We have an alt, which is for images. We have a base URL, and we have this keyword here, checked. Checked is equal to false in the second example. Let's look at checked in the first example. Checked is equal to true. So if I'm using radio buttons, I'm going to use the attribute checked. I'm going to use this property to determine whether the element was selected or not. Okay, so let's print out the checked property. Okay, so I'm going to print this out. I'm going to save the file, refresh the page, click on Get Radio. You'll see the radio button is selecting Velociraptor. So checked is true. Let's say I select T-Rex, do Get. You'll see checked is false. So if I want to determine whether a radio button is selected or not, I need to use the .checked property. Now this is important. For an exam, I may have some radio buttons and I may have some code and the code's doing .value. You'll want to know for a radio button, you use .check. So remember that for a quiz or for an exam. Also remember for a text field, which was our previous example, we're going to use the .value. But it's not always the case. You can't use .value for everything. Each input type is different, thus using a different property. So if I'm using .check to get the value, I can also use .check to set the value. So here, when I'm setting a value, I don't necessarily need to save it, so I can use the DOM, get element by ID. I'm going to be looking for Raptor, and I'm going to change the value by setting it equal to something. So in programming in general, if I want to get the value, I'll just call the .value property. If I want to set the value, I always set it equal to something. So let's say I set it equal to true. This will make sure I select the Velociraptor radio button. So let's save the file, Control S or Command S, refresh the page, click on T-Rex, do a get, you'll see it's false, then do a set. Okay, nothing's happening. What's happening here? So I'm trying to call set radio. I'm calling document.getElementById. I'm looking for Raptor. I'm trying to set value equal to true. It's not working because radio buttons don't use value. I must use the checked property. So let's switch this to checked. Save it, refresh the page, click on T-Rex, do a get, you'll see it's false. Do a set, you'll see the value has changed. Do a get, now you'll see it's true. So I can get or set the value of a radio button using the .check property. Now how can I get all the radio buttons? Well, I could use the getElementById and I could get each radio button independently, but it'd be nicer to say I want to reference all the radio buttons, but we don't know how to do that. So let's look at these radio buttons. You'll see I have IDs for each of them. Now what happens if I have JavaScript and that dynamically adds a new input element? I'd have to use another getElementById, so now I have 4 lines of code, which is very inefficient and not a good way to program. So how can I program this without hard coding it to each individual ID? Let's say that ID changes. Well, then I have to change the line of code up here as well since it's hard coded, and that it just gets complicated. So if I open up this input type, you'll see I have the ID. The other thing I also have is the name. So if I open this up, if I look at these input elements, what is the same between all of them? The first option would be the type. I could say, okay, any radio buttons on the page, I want to get elements by type. We saw that was an option. If I want to be more specific, I could say get elements by name, since the name is the same between all 3, which is the way I recommend. So it'd be nicer to say I want to get all the radio buttons with a name attribute, and we're going to set that name attribute to dinosaurs. So here I'm going to grab all the radio objects with an S. I'm going to use the DOM just like we did before, but instead of getElementById, I can get elements by name. And the name we're going to provide is dinosaurs. Okay, if I get by name, instead of this just being one object, it's actually going to be an array of objects. Let's print that out so we can see what I'm talking about. Every time you're dealing with a new item, a new DOM object, make sure you print that out so you know what you're dealing with. So I'm going to print that out. I'm going to save the file, refresh the page, and click on Get All Radio Buttons. You'll see it's a node list of 3. So it's an array or a list of 3. The first one is input ID Raptor. Second one is input Iguanodon. Third one is input T-Rex. So you see the length is 3 and it starts with an index of 0. So once I have this array or list, I can loop through them. I can create a for loop var. I equal to 0. This is a standard for loop similar to C. I'll say I is less than the radio objects. Remember, I have the .length property, and I can say I plus plus. I'm going to make a block of code for this, and I'm going to print this out. So I'll do a console log. I'll say, okay, the radio object's first index, so index I, we're going to print out the ID of it. And then I'm going to concatenate this. So that's what the plus symbol is. I'm concatenating two strings or two objects. This is a string object, and I'm concatenating it or adding it. So I'm combining it with the equals with spaces on both sides. And I'm going to combine this with the value. How do I know the value of a radio object? Well, it's going to be whether it's checked or not. So I'll say radio objects, whatever index I'm on, dot checked. So if we look at this, the entire code segment, you'll see I'm going to print out the ID, and then I'm going to concatenate it with this string. I'm going to say that ID is equal to whether it's checked or not. So if I save this, refresh the page, click on get radio, you'll see it's true. Set it to T-Rex, do get, you'll see it's false. If I do a set, you'll see now it's true again. If I refresh the page and do a get all radios, you'll see Raptor's true, Iguanodon's false, T-Rex is false. If I click on Iguanodon, get all, you'll see Iguanodon's true, everyone else is false. If I do T-Rex, get all, you'll see everyone's false, but T-Rex is true. So if I want to get all the radio buttons, I'm going to do that based off the name attribute. Okay, here's the name. It's set to dinosaurs for all of them. When I do get elements by name, it's going to return an array. Even if there's only one object, it's going to be an array of 1. And then I can use a for loop to loop through all the elements and print them out one by one and whether they're checked or not. So let's write a little note, make sure we understand this. As we just saw, we could use the get element by ID for all three, but that's not a good idea because what if the ID changes, or what if we add another element or get rid of an element? This code would crash. So instead of using the get element by ID to get each radio input, it'd be nicer to say I want to reference all the radio inputs. But how can we do that? We can do that by using the name attribute, which in this case was set to dinosaur. When I use the name attribute, it's going to return an array. I can loop through the array and determine which items are there and also which ones are checked. What's nice about this code here is it's dynamic. As long as the name stays the same, I can add or subtract radio buttons, and this for loop will still run based off the radio object's length. So this is a better way to program by making it more dynamic. That's it for this subsection. We're going to move on to number 4, checkboxes. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.